Ancient Chinese texts gave snake years a dark reputation. They described them as years of betrayal, hidden conflict, upheaval, and transformation. At first, that sounded like superstition, but then I looked at the historical record, and what I found was a pattern that's hard to ignore. But before we look at the history, we need to understand what the snake actually represents in Chinese astrology. Unlike the dragon, which symbolizes power and ambition, the snake has always been associated with things that operate beneath the surface. Ancient texts describe the snake as wise, strategic, secretive, and patient. It doesn't charge forward, it waits, it observes, and when the moment is right, it strikes. Because of this, snake years developed a unique reputation.
The snake in Chinese astrology is a very venomous and vengeful animal. So expect a lot of people to get revenge next year.
Systems that seemed stable suddenly begin to crack, and perhaps most importantly, when transformation becomes unavoidable. After all, the snake is one of the oldest symbols of renewal. It sheds its skin, something old is discarded, something new emerges. So if the ancient Chinese were observing a real pattern, we shouldn't expect every snake year to look the same. Instead, we should expect to see the same themes repeating throughout history, and that's exactly where things start to get interesting. One historical example occurred in 1989 during what would become one of the most consequential political crises of the late 20th century. On April 15, 1989, the death of former Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang sparked gatherings of university students across Beijing. Many saw him as a symbol of political reform. What began as a memorial quickly evolved into something much larger. Students from Peking University, Tsinghua University, and other institutions began calling for greater political transparency, freedom of the press, and action against corruption. Their message resonated far beyond the campuses. Within weeks, crowds in Tiananmen Square had grown into the hundreds of thousands. Workers joined the demonstrations, then journalists and ordinary citizens joined the demonstrations. Similar protests appeared in cities across China. By May, the movement had become one of the largest public challenges the Chinese government had faced in decades. The eyes of the world turned toward Beijing. On the night of June 3rd and into the early hours of June 4th, troops moved into the city. Gunfire erupted, armored vehicles advanced toward the center of the protests. The exact number of deaths remains disputed. Estimates range from several hundred to potentially more than 1,000 people killed. What is certain is that the events of 1989 became one of the defining moments of modern Chinese history. To many observers, the crisis appeared sudden, a dramatic eruption that seemed to emerge without warning. Yet the forces behind it had been building for years. Economic reforms had transformed Chinese society. Expectations were rising. Frustrations were growing. Beneath the surface, pressure continued to accumulate. The demonstrations did not create that tension. They revealed it. And that is where the connection to the snake becomes interesting. Ancient interpretations of the sign often focused on hidden forces, developments unfolding quietly beneath the surface until they could no longer remain concealed. Not the explosion itself, the pressure that made the explosion inevitable. In that sense, the story of 1989 was not simply a protest. It was an exposure, the sudden appearance of tensions that had been building for years, largely unseen, until they burst into full view before the world. And 1989 would not be the only snake year marked by forces gathering in the shadows. Is it a coincidence that some of history's most famous acts of revenge occurred during snake years? February 21st, 1965. Just after 3 p.m., Malcolm X stepped onto the stage of the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. More than 400 people had gathered to hear him speak. He never got the chance. Moments after taking the stage, gunfire erupted. Witnesses dove for cover. Panic swept through the ballroom. Within seconds, one of the most influential voices of the civil rights era lay mortally wounded. Malcolm X was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was 39 years old. The assassination shocked America, yet the killing itself was only the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding for years. Behind the speeches, the headlines, and the public appearances, a bitter conflict had been growing. Malcolm's relationship with the Nation of Islam had deteriorated dramatically. Former allies became opponents. Public disagreements gave way to personal hostility. Threats followed. His home was firebombed just 1 week before his death. The tension was no longer hidden. It was reaching a breaking point. Ancient interpretations of the snake often focused on forces operating in the shadows, rivalries, betrayals, grievances left unresolved, conflicts that build quietly until a decisive moment arrives. Whether coincidence or pattern, the story of Malcolm X reflects another theme long associated with snake years: the settling of old scores. Yet snake years are associated with more than hidden rivalries and acts of revenge. Ancient texts also link the sign to upheaval, moments where the familiar order suddenly gives way to something entirely different, moments that divide history into a before and an after. One of the clearest examples occurred on September 11, 2001. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center. At first, many assumed it was a terrible accident. 17 minutes later, that assumption vanished. A second aircraft struck the South Tower. Millions watched the events unfold live. Within less than 2 hours, both towers had collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The attacks became the deadliest act of terrorism in modern history. The shock was immediate. The consequences would last for decades. Security policies were rewritten. Governments expanded surveillance powers. Military campaigns were launched across the Middle East. Entire generations would grow up in a world shaped by the aftermath. For many, the 21st century truly began on that day. Like the events of 1989 and 1965, the attacks appeared sudden. Like the forces behind them had been developing for years. Networks were built, plans were made, warnings were missed. Beneath the surface, a threat was growing largely unseen. Then, in a single morning, it emerged before the eyes of the world. Ancient interpretations of the snake often focused on transformation through crisis, the collapse of one reality, the emergence of another, a decisive break between what came before and what followed. Whether coincidence or pattern, few events reflect that symbolism more dramatically than September 11th. In a matter of hours, the course of modern history changed. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of the snake was never conflict, nor revenge, nor even catastrophe. It was trans- Yet perhaps the most important aspect of the snake was never conflict, revenge, catastrophe. It was transformation. For thousands of years, the snake has been a symbol of renewal, a creature capable of shedding its skin and emerging changed. Ancient cultures saw this process as a powerful metaphor: the end of one phase, the beginning of another. Looking back at the events we've explored, that symbolism appears again and again. The protests of 1989 transformed China's relationship with political dissent. The assassination of Malcolm X transformed his legacy, elevating him from a controversial figure into a global icon whose influence continues decades after his death. The attacks of September 11th transformed international politics and reshaped the 21st century. Different countries and outcomes, yet each marked a moment where an old reality gave way to a new one. And that may explain why snake years have fascinated people for centuries, not because they predict specific events, but because they appear to reflect the recurring pattern in human history. Pressure builds, conflicts emerge, existing structures are challenged, and eventually something changes. Looking back, 2025 was itself a snake year, a year marked by transition, uncertainty, and change. Across the world, institutions faced new challenges. Old assumptions continued to be questioned. New leaders emerged. Even the Catholic Church entered a new chapter with the election of a new pope, a moment of profound significance for more than 1 billion Catholics worldwide. Whether viewed through the lens of history, faith, or symbolism, the theme feels familiar: the ending of one chapter, the beginning of another. And perhaps that is why the snake has remained such a powerful symbol for thousands of years, not because it predicts the future, but because it reflects a pattern woven throughout human history. Hidden tensions eventually surface. Conflicts reach their breaking point. Old structures give way to new realities. And from that uncertainty, transformation emerges. The snake sheds its skin. The world moves forward. A new chapter begins. Maybe that was the real lesson ancient Chinese astrologers were trying to preserve. Not a prophecy, a reminder that renewal often arrives disguised as crisis, and that every age, sooner or later, must shed its old skin.